Welcome to our 5th class on Jesus and his parables. Today we will look at the parable of the Great Banquet, a parable that pictures salvation as a banquet where all peoples and nations are invited. To set the stage of the parable, let's go back to the beginning of Luke chapter 14, where we find Jesus at the house of a Pharisee on the Sabbath. Speakers at the synagogue were often invited to the Sabbath meal after the worship service, and so Jesus is sitting among many people who were opposed to him and his teaching. Just moments before, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, challenging the Pharisees' concerns for rituals and traditions above the plight of their fellow human beings. Jesus demonstrated that the law requires love and action, not keeping up appearances. Jesus noticed how hosts sent invitations just to their wealthy friends and how the guests seated themselves based upon their rank. In contrast, Jesus taught that the believers are to be humble and seek ways to serve the less fortunate. Now, let's turn to the text of the parable itself. I'd encourage you to download the handout of the text found on the class website and follow along. The parable starts with a pious outburst. "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." The speaker is pointing forward to the expected messianic banquet at the end of the age. The prophet Isaiah describes a sumptuous banquet at the end of time. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain, he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Notice the word all. Gentiles will be included in this great banquet where God even destroys death. Even though the nations usually bring gifts to God, Isaiah talks of a reversal where God brings the gift of the banquet to the people. At the banquet, people are served rich food, the food of kings. During the time of Isaiah and the early post-exilic prophets, Jews believed that Gentiles would take part in the messianic banquet. The Gentiles would gain salvation as a gift along with the Jews. This idea that the Gentiles would be included in God's kingdom became muted through the years, and this dream of an inclusive kingdom was lost during the intertestamental period. We read in the apocryphal book of 1 Enoch. "And all the kings and the mighty and the exalted and those Gentiles shall fall down before him on their faces. All worship and set their hope upon the Son of Man. And he will deliver them to the angels for punishment, and they shall be a spectacle for the righteous and for his elect, because the wrath of the Lord of spirits rests upon them, and his sword is drunk with their blood." Several centuries before Jesus, the Gentiles are no longer considered fit to include in the kingdom of God. During the 1st century AD, the Essenes were a group of Jews who believed that the Messiah would gather the whole community of Jews to eat bread and drink wine together. The wise, the intelligent, and the perfect would gather with the Messiah himself, assembled by rank. No one would be allowed in the banquet if they were paralyzed in their hands or feet, or if they were lame, blind, deaf, or had a physical flaw. All the Gentiles were excluded in this image, as were the Jews who weren't considered perfect. The dream of Isaiah, where Jew and Gentile were included in God's plan of salvation, was progressively limited to the point where only the perfect Jew could take part in the messianic banquet. This pious guest would have been functioning with this background, and the other guests would have responded with something like, "May we be among the righteous, without blemish, worthy to sit with the men of distinction on that day." Jesus doesn't respond by agreeing with them, but with a parable. Let's fill in a few details. The host is a great and prominent man in the community. He was able to host a great banquet and invited many people, so we can assume he's wealthy as well. His guests are his peers and associates, the beautiful people in the community. 2 invitations are sent out for a banquet. The first is kind of like a save the date that you would receive before a wedding invitation. This first invitation helps the host plan the menu. He would be expected to serve meat, but you need to know how many guests are coming to know what animal, whether chickens, ducks, lamb, sheep, to serve and how many to slaughter. Once the animal is killed, you must eat it that night. So once the countdown for the feast starts, you can't interrupt it. So this save the date kind of invitation is a serious one. And if you accept, you are committed and you must show up. The host completes the preparations and sends his servant with the second invitation, which is essentially, "Come, everything's ready to eat. food is on the table. But now, the excuses start flying. The Greek that's translated as all alike means everyone, all at once, start making excuses. Jesus' audience would have been appalled. The responses of the guests are both surprising and insulting. Refusing at the last minute is the worst kind of manners and an insult to the great generosity of the host. Let's take a look at each excuse. In the Middle East, as in most of the world, you don't buy a field without first getting to know it well. As a farmer, my dad knew the characteristics of the many fields in the area, where the sandy hills were, where the low spots were that stayed wet longer, how the yields were on each field. And it's no different in the Middle East. Before a farmer even begins to bargain to buy a field, he knows where the trees and the walls are, whether you get water from wells or springs, if there are any paths through the field. He would also know who had owned the field for generations and what kind of crops grew best and the profits he could expect. Yet, this man's excuse was that he'd bought a field sight unseen. This is nuts. Would you buy a house unseen? What the guest is really saying is, I don't like you, and I hope your whole party is boring. He's putting his most recent purchase over his relationship with the host. The next excuse is just as lame. In the Middle East, when you buy animals, you have two options. You can go to the marketplace where the animals are being sold, knowing that there's a field nearby where you can test the animal's ability to work the field. This is especially important when you buy a team of animals. You need to know if they're able to work well together. The second option is to buy directly from an owner who announced he has animals for sale. The prospective buyers would be invited to the farm to watch the animals work in the fields to see how capable they were. Notice the person in Jesus' parable has bought 5 teams of oxen, sight unseen. Again, that's crazy. You wouldn't buy 1 used car without knowing if it starts, much less 5 used cars. Here's an interesting nuance Jesus was playing with in telling this story. Animals were considered unclean, and so the guest is essentially telling the host that an unclean creature is more important than he is. This guest wants to make sure his insult is clearly understood. The third man's excuse is even weaker and actually inappropriate. Even if the man had recently been married, his wedding would not have been on the same day as this banquet. No Middle Eastern village could handle 2 big events on the same day. There would be just too much competition. An important cultural nuance here is that men in Middle Eastern society are quite reserved when talking about the women in their lives. As an example, a man who was writing home to his children when he was away traveling wouldn't address the letter to the 2 daughters he already had, but it would address it to the son he hopes he'll have in the future. Very different from our Western culture. When the apocryphal book, Sirach, praises the great people in the history of Israel, all of those cited are men. Even though we know there are great women in Israel's history, such as Deborah, Huldah, Ruth, and Esther, among others. Men in this ancient Middle Eastern culture were very reluctant to mention women. So we realize this third man is essentially saying, yesterday I said I'd come, but today I'm busy with my wife, so I'm not coming. He would rather stay home with his new bride, which to our ears sounds really romantic. A man saying his wife was more important than the banquet would be considered rude in many societies, but in the Middle East, it's extremely rude. His excuse for not coming is guaranteed to infuriate any Middle Eastern man. And notice, this man doesn't even ask to be excused like the first 2 men did. His behavior is meant to offend the host. Apparently, the original guests thought their rejection of the host's invitation would humiliate the host. The meal couldn't go on without them, the worthy guests. But though the host is angry with those he invited first, he chooses to act in grace and surprise these so-called elites. He invites unworthy guests instead. These other guests would have been considered on the margin of polite society, the outcasts and the ostracized. The host invites exactly those people who are explicitly excluded by these scenes, the poor, maimed, blind, and lame. Notice the reversals. The blind cannot see, so they can't make the excuse they need to go see a field. The lame have trouble walking, so they cannot test oxen by plowing in a field. The poor aren't invited to banquets because they can't reciprocate with a similar invitation. Yet there is still room for more. The host next sends his servant out to the highways and hedges. The highways are the big roads that connect large towns where you would find a mixture of Jew and Gentile traveling. The hedges are the small lanes that often have walls or hedges along their sides where the local people travel. The word compel is significant. These people, who the elite consider unworthy, would need convincing that the host is serious about inviting them to the banquet. In the Middle East, an unexpected invitation would be refused, especially if you were of a lower social rank than the person extending the invitation. These other guests would need some serious persuasion. The servant may need to even take them by the arm and lead them to the banquet in order to convince them that the invitation was real. The house can be full even without the original invitees. A full house is a success. An empty house makes it look like the important people rejected the host. Even though the great men are absent, the banquet is still a great success. The original Greek in this verse uses the plural you in Greek, so Jesus has reverted to speaking to the crowd gathered around him. The meal Jesus talked about in the parable has become his messianic banquet, and he is the host. The original group that was invited to the banquet are the Jewish leaders who refused the invitation. The blind and the lame are the outcasts within the house of Israel who accepted the invitation. The guests from the highways and hedges are the Gentiles who had to be compelled to believe that the invitation was for them. Jesus' message is straightforward. The Messianic kingdom has arrived and all is ready. Come and celebrate. But the Jewish religious leaders only offer excuses. Jesus doesn't keep the Sabbath. He eats with sinners. He isn't the kind of Messiah I want who fills my theological and my political expectations. Because the Jewish leaders aren't open to the breadth and depth of God's love, they are in danger of missing out on Jesus' great banquet. Now notice, the servant who is sent out to extend the invitation to the banquet speaks with the voice and authority of the host, who he addresses as master. Though the people are speaking with the servant, they are actually dealing with the master himself. As we are relating to Jesus, we are relating to God. The Messianic banquet is ready. It won't be canceled or postponed if we don't show up. We'll simply miss out. Others will take our place. We can't have the food delivered via DoorDash because we're busy with other things. If we want to enjoy the celebration, we must answer and join in. Don't miss the deeper theological message Jesus has. Jesus does not teach that some are predestined to be included in the kingdom while others are predestined to be excluded. Our entry into the kingdom isn't because of what we do, but because we are invited in by God himself. And if we remain outside the kingdom, it's not because we haven't been invited in, because we choose not to accept the greatest gift ever offered. So to summarize this parable, Jesus is the Messiah God sent to call all people to the great messianic banquet of salvation. The excuses people give for refusing to respond to God's invitation are stupid and insulting. The invitation is extended to outcasts who are both inside and outside the community. God's grace is so amazing. Sometimes people need to be convinced God's grace is for them. You can choose to cut yourself off from God's invitation to the banquet. And time will eventually run out on the invitation, so respond now. Thanks for joining us. Next week, we will look at the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin. So please read Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 10 to prepare. Until then, keep the faith.